The topic we're going to talk about today is one that has actually been I've been a part of. I grew up on a seed stock operation, had the opportunity to run a cow-calf operation myself for a while, managed a ranch, Laster Beef Masters in Colorado, the foundation herd of the Beefmaster breed for 3 years. And so this topic of Optimum and what's Optimum genetics has been one that I've been challenged with really since I was in grade school in terms of what kind of cow do we want genetically based on where we're at, the environment we have, the resources we have. This was all shared a little bit, but you're well aware of the number of beef cows that are in this part of the world, and you look at your state here is in the top 10, your neighbor to the south in the top 12. You look at cows per square mile, Nebraska is kind of the cows per square mile sandwich there between Kentucky and Tennessee, so lots of cows here. Of course, you look at the number of beef cows just in the state of Kentucky, 900,000 beef cows. You're well aware, largest beef state east of the Mississippi. You actually combine your cows with your cows to the south, your neighbors, you'd have more cows than we have in Nebraska. So a lot of beef cows here, and it just, I think, points to the importance of having cows that meet the environmental resources you have and doing that effectively. I just out of curiosity looked at the town of Owensboro and took a 50-mile radius. There's about 250,000 beef cows within 50-mile radius of Owensboro. Again, there's just a lot of beef cows here, and I think recognizing that's pretty important. As Dr. Davis well shared, you're in the heart of the fescue belt, and you understand the challenges that go with that. Tremendous opportunity, but tremendous challenge. And a lot of states impacted by the fescue belt and that forage resource. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of the cows in the United States are in the fescue belt. And so the importance of having a cow that can use that resource effectively is critically important. Dr. Davis, we didn't coordinate this, but it's so interesting for her to share her data because what I'm talking about ties directly with what she shared with you around if you take cattle from a different environment and move them, they're not going to perform as well. There's an adaptation phase. I think we recognize that. Of course, where you're at, you would be classified as more of a humid subtropical climate. You look at western Nebraska, we're a high, dry type climate. Very different resource base there than what you have in Kentucky. I don't think it should come as a surprise is that cows that work in western Nebraska probably don't work in Kentucky. And that's not a surprise. And so as we think about the climate differences that we deal with in the United States in terms of what we ask cows to do, where we ask them to produce, it's drastically different. Hopefully you don't see that kind of calf here in Kentucky very often, but where I'm at, we're at about 4,800 feet, and actually the county right next to me canceled their last day of school in May here about 3 years ago because of a blizzard. That's in May, all right? So we raise cows in a situation where we can have snow 9 months out of the year pretty routinely. And so what your cattle deal with here is very different. But we raise cattle in the deserts of the Southwest. We got cows grazing swamp grass in Florida. There's some very different resources available and stresses that these cattle encounter. This is a chart put together by the Beef Improvement Federation, a group of well-thought individuals put this together. What I like about this matrix or this chart is it kind of gives you a set of guidelines to think about based on my resources, based on the environmental stresses I have, what are probably the genetic parameters I need to be thinking about in terms of selecting for genetics that fit those resources. As you look at this, what you're going to notice as feed availability goes up and the quality of that feed goes up and I have less stress, I can use genetics that have greater growth potential, greater milk production, and don't need to carry as much body condition score to manage through those difficult times, whether that's heat stress, cold stress, whatever it is. As I move down the chart, as forage availability is less, as quality of forage is less, and I have higher levels of stress, guess what? I cannot probably utilize genetics that have as much growth potential or milk production and expect those to be expressed and have an animal that's also as reproductively efficient. And I think if we think about that, that just makes sense. Again, we did not talk about this, but it's very intriguing. The cattle in Montana probably don't work as well as the cattle in Florida. So this is a picture of a Domino Hereford line bull going back to the 50s. And some of you who are familiar with the Hereford breed know about the Domino line, a well-known Hereford line of cattle. So they basically took that line in Montana, developed it there for a number of years, took those same genetics, moved them to Florida, had them there for a period of time, adapted them, and then they did a flip-flop, just like Dr. Davis shared with their work in Kentucky, Montana. Well, lo and behold, what do you think the results were? Montana line cows did not do as well as Florida, and the Florida line cows did not do as well in Montana. Probably shouldn't come as a surprise, right? As we had time to adapt those genetics to their resources, guess what? We selected for cattle that more adapted to and better utilize those resources. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. This is a chart put together by the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, and basically several thousand cows here where they've looked at genetic trends over time within breeds. The interesting thing about this research center is they put together the cross-breed EPD evaluation where they're taking the most popular bulls from respective breeds, breeding them to genetically similar cows, and then looking at the results of those progeny so that you can compare a Hereford bull to an Angus bull, to a Charolais bull, to a Brangus bull, and say how would these bulls compare to one another in terms of their progeny. What I want you to see there, if you look at that black line, that's the most populous breed in the United States in terms of registrations, which is Angus. This is going back to 1972. Has there been tremendous genetic change made by the Angus breed over the last 50 years? You betcha, okay? Tremendous genetic change. When you look at what that breed has done, they've made tremendous genetic change. Also, almost all breeds, with the exception of a few, have selected for greater yearling weight, greater growth and performance, and I think we just got to recognize that's what's happened. The other thing they do at the Meat Animal Research Center, which I find very intriguing, is they compare the progeny of those most popular bulls to one another. In this case, they're taking those out and looking at what these cows become in terms of mature cow weight. You look at that top number there, Angus, basically what they're saying is we're going to use the most populous breed in the United States. That's going to be our base that we compare to. So what this is saying here, from an adjusted mature cow weight, if it's a minus number, that means that cow on average compared to their base Angus cow from the most popular bulls utilized is a little bit less in mature weight. If it's a positive number, they're a little bit more. The take home here is there's only one breed that's significantly less in terms of mature cow weight, and that's a breed called Bronve. Everything else is within 50 pounds. Folks, there is not that much difference today among the trait leaders between breeds and when you look at mature cow weight. We can no longer say, well, that Angus cow, that Hereford cow, that's the maternal breed. She's more moderate in her milk and size. Now, are there individuals and breeders within that breed that are that way? Yes, there are. But you can no longer classify and say, well, this is a terminal breed. There are some Angus bulls out there that are terminal bulls, in my opinion, in terms of their growth, performance, and what they do. So just recognize that as we're thinking about genetic selection, trying to identify cattle that work for us. I just can't go pick this breed and say, well, this breed's going to work for me. You got to look at individuals within a breed, the breeders, where those cattle come from, if you're trying to drive your genetics to a direction you want it to go. Milk production. We have been amazing at what we've been able to do with milk production as well in terms of genetic change. If you look here again, that black line on the bottom, over the last 35 years, Angus has, on average, made tremendous change in terms of milk production level in their cows. Also, you look at the breed like Hereford, same thing. Tremendous levels of milk production. So to say that an Angus cow is going to produce less milk today or Hereford cow is going to produce less milk may not be very accurate. You got to look at what levels of milk production are actually there. Some of you might be saying, why are we looking at a dairy cow at a beef convention? But I want you to take a good look at that dairy cow. Does she look like today's Holstein cows as you look at her phenotypically? No, she does not. She looks a lot more blocky in her type. This cow genetically would be very similar to a Holstein cow from early 1960s. The reason I brought this cow up, this is a picture of a cow that's at a research center in Minnesota where they do some more grazing-based type dairy. But in 1960, interesting, I looked this up, average Holstein herd in the United States, 305-day lactation, produced about 7,000 pounds of milk, or about 23 pounds of milk per day. Keep that 23-pound number in mind because it's going to show up here interestingly in a little bit. This is a research study out of the University of Tennessee, your neighbor to the south, did about a decade ago, where they looked at Angus-based cows at research centers in Tennessee. There was about 230 cows in the study, and they evaluated the milk production level of these cows using a weigh-suckle-weigh method. And these were cows that were not in a limited resource environment. Had the opportunity to work with this researcher. You know, basically these cows had all the nutrition they needed to express their genetic potential. Lo and behold, when they broke these cows out, broke them into different tiers in terms of milk production level, they measured it about 60 days post-calving, which would be a little bit past what we would think about peak milk production for a beef cow. They also measured it about 4.5 months post-milk production. And then they broke those cows into low, moderate, and high based on that weigh-suckle weigh data. If you look at the right, look at those high milk production beef cows. How much milk were they producing? 28 pounds, about 60 days, 24 pounds, about 4.5 months out. How much milk was that dairy cow producing in 1960? We now have Angus cows that produce like Dill Holstein cows did in 1960. I think that's pretty intriguing. Also, if you look at the moderate milk cows, they're not very far behind them, are they? That's a lot of milk, folks, and I think we have to recognize that comes with some nutritional challenges and demands from a cow perspective. So they tracked the calves. Well, those high milk cows must have produced some really big calves, right? They must have been a lot bigger than those low milk cows. Interestingly, no. You look here, there was really no difference in terms of weaning weight between the moderate milk cows and the high milk cows when you went out to actual weaning weight, 205 adjusted weight, and those two groups were only 20 pounds heavier than the low milk cows. 20 pounds heavier, that's all the heavier they were. Well, those cows, how did they breed up? Well, if we look at that, interestingly, the high milk cows, when you looked at pounds weaned per cow exposed, were actually the least productive because of reproductive rate. When we look at, in this case, they were doing one round of AI on these cows and then exposing them to a cleanup bowl. Those cows that were high milk production had the poorest AI preg rate and poorest overall final preg rate. In this case, the moderate cows were the best and the low were a little bit below them. But those cows that had high levels of milk production were not as reproductively efficient. Now, some of you might be saying, well, they must have just not had enough feed. We got to feed those cows more. Well, they looked at cow body condition score, and what's interesting here, from a body condition score standpoint, those cows were not really any different at calving, at that first lactation period, or at the end of the breeding season than their counterparts. In fact, the high milk cows numerically were a little bit higher. So did they have adequate nutrition? From an observation standpoint, it sure looks like it, but because of that high levels of milk production, they were not as reproductively efficient. And I think we recognize what's a major challenge for a dairy operation? It's to get a cow rebred, right? That's one of their major challenges. You think about how long a dairy cow lasts. I think it's around 2.5 to 3 lactations, somewhere in there. Is it a surprise that on these very high milk production cows, we're struggling with reproduction? As we think about that data I shared earlier in terms of what's the genetic change we've made in these breeds, we saw tremendous change in yearling weight, and we've seen tremendous change in milk production levels and basically across many of these most popular breeds. Are we realizing that at the cow-calf level? This is some data out of North Dakota, long-term data set, and this is commercial cow-calf operators who are taking their own data. They're taking birth dates, birth weights, measuring weaning weights on the calves, body condition scoring the cows, weighing those cows at weaning. They turn in their data to this conglomerate. There's about 60,000 cows here that are part of this. And then they get that data back from the North Dakota State University group, and then they can evaluate how their cow herd compares to others. These are cows from North Dakota, South Dakota. There's some in Minnesota, some in Nebraska. To be part of this group, you have to report your data consistently for 3 years, and you have to have at least 50 cows. Well, in my opinion, if you're going to that kind of effort with your cow herd, you're probably also using above average bulls. You're probably not using scrubs, okay? So these folks have been using good genetics for a long period of time. What's interesting to me, we remember that genetic trend we've seen in terms of increased yearling weight, increased milk production. If you look over the last 15, 20 years, have they really changed the productivity level of their cows in this data set? The answer is no. There's really not been any change in terms of preg rates, percent of calf crop weaned, weaning weights over the last 15, 20 years. Well, how is it that some of these best producers in these states, probably using above breed average bulls, are no longer seeing any genetic change, or I shouldn't say see genetic change, not seeing any of the benefit of genetic change in terms of actual productivity on their operations? And it's my opinion that in many cases, we now have cattle that genetically are way beyond the production potential of the environment, and we're not seeing that being realized in terms of actual production at the farm or ranch level. And I think that brings some challenges to us, because I think rarely is maximum optimum. Meaning if I'm maximizing production, I'm probably giving some things up in terms of what's optimum for my resource, because I'm having to match or meet that cow's requirements that are beyond what my resources can produce. We recognize that environmental stress, whatever that is, whether it's nutritional or heat or fescue toxicity, impacts things like reproduction, health, longevity, impacts things like growth and milk production. Dr. Tavis illustrated that really well. It impacts cow body condition. Those things are all impacted by those stresses. Well, if we have cattle that are not adapted, that are not the right optimum level of genetics for a resource, it shouldn't come as a surprise that maybe we're struggling some with the efficiency or the effectiveness of those cows with that resource. So I'm going to kind of change gears a little bit here, but I think as we think about genetic selection and identifying genetics that are optimum, we have to recognize that maximum may not be optimum for our resource. Meaning that bull trait leader that we often want to go buy at the sale may not really fit our resources very well, because he's got too much milk, too much growth for that animal to work in the resource I have. Now I recognize my saying that's probably stepping on some toes, because for so long, more has been better, bigger has been better, and I think in some cases we've went by where we want to be in terms of optimum for a given set of resources and environment. And also I think we cannot overlook at the commercial cow-calf level the benefits of hybrid vigor. And I also recognize that for many folks, they've kind of thrown up their hands around the hybrid vigor thing and said, it's too complicated, I can't keep track of which bull was sired by which cow, I get these mismatched calves, I'm just going to keep things straight and we're going to go on and forget about that. The challenge with that is when you do that, you also give up reproductive efficiency and productivity at the commercial cow-calf level. This is some old data out of Meat Animal Research Center, Nebraska, but it's good data, and I've not yet seen any data that would refute it. But basically it says if I've got a crossbred cow compared to her two straight-bred counterparts, she's going to be more productive, going to wean more calves, going to stay in the herd longer. This would have been late 70s, 80s types genetics in terms of Hereford Angus, shorthorn cows. Basically they compared those to one another, had a straight-bred Angus, straight-bred Hereford, and said what's their productivity level. If I've got a cross of those two, what's that cow's productivity level? Basically that F1 cow is going to live or stay in your herd about a year longer, a little more than that, and she's going to produce one more calf. Well, if you think about the economic value today of one more calf, that's $1,400 probably in Kentucky. That's a lot of value that you got from a cow that stayed in the herd, was more productive, and was able to use your resources. We also know there's, this is a chart from Dr. Bob Weber from Kansas State University. There's not only the heterosis of the cow, but there's the benefit of the calf that gets as well in terms of their production. We know that Bos Taurus crosses, a British cross by Continental or British by British, there's benefit to that crossbred animal. But there's also tremendous benefit from this, in my opinion, in this part of the world if we have some Bos Indicus in there. Now I recognize also there's some challenges that come with the Bos Indicus cattle, but for heat stress, for pest tolerance, those cattle bring some good that I think is kind of hard to overlook as we think about a calf at the commercial cow-calf level. This is a quote from Dr. Larry Cundiff, Mark Tallman and Larry Kuhn. Dr. Cundiff's since passed away, but studied a lot of genetics in a lot of different regions. And I'll just read the quote. He says, in more intermediate subtropical regions of the U.S., cow herds with a ratio of 25 to 70% Bos Indicus to Bos Taurus appear to be optimal. A Bos Indicus Bos Taurus cross cow excels in cow efficiency, production, and longevity because of the extra heterosis. And so it's just pretty hard to give that up if you're dealing with an environment where you've got these kind of challenges, and that can bring that kind of good to you in terms of productivity. I mentioned that I had the opportunity to be part of the Beefmaster breed when I graduated from college. And I'll be honest, I came from Nebraska, and we thought anything that had ear in Nebraska kind of like had the plague. You didn't want to get too close to that because what might happen, right? And then I had the opportunity to go be part of that, and those were functional cattle that worked well in basically it was about 6,800 feet there. Those cattle worked well in that environment, had been adapted to that environment, and so I had to have some of my paradigm shattered, and I realized that Bos indicus can bring some good to a beef cattle situation. So that upper left is a beef master bull, upper right Santa Gertrudis, lower left red Brangus, lower right Cimbra. And so folks in the United States have known for well over the last 100 years that there's often some real benefit to including some of that as a part of a commercial cow-calf operation if you're thinking about Optimum for a given set of resources. There's also the opportunity to use some heat-adapted breeds if you don't want to include some Bos indicus. That upper left there is a Bonsmara breed, upper right Mashona. Both are native from Africa. The lower left is Senapole, developed in the Mediterranean. Lower right is Romo Sinuano. Again, heat-adapted breeds that bring some good. Not saying that this should be your purebred, but some of this at a quarter level might really bring some value to having some cattle that can utilize low-quality forage in a heat-stress environment. This is a chart that you often see if you look at a crossbreeding program, and I'm not going to try to go through the details here. Many of the folks I work with at a commercial cow-calf level are just, again, they think about crossbreeding, they've tried it, and they throw their hands in the air and say, I'm frustrated, I can't have a uniform calf crop, I can't keep track of which cows are by which bull, and it's just not worth it. But that's where I think we have to look at the opportunity to utilize something today like a composite breed or F1s that you can purchase to continue to maintain some level of heterosis in your commercial cow herd, but also keep it simple. And that's where a composite breed, basically all those American breeds are composite breeds, right? They were some Brahman, and then there's either Angus or Hereford or Shorthorn or whatever else, and they put those together. Those, in my opinion, are really a composite breed. Now, there might be some that would argue with that, but that's really what they are. And we think about some of the other composite breeds that have been developed recently. There's the South Pole composite breed. And then there's also a lot of F1 type bulls out there today, whether they're Angus Sim, Angus Limousine, Angus Gelve, that a person can use to maintain some heterosis in your cow herd and still get the benefit of that. While you're not maybe maximizing heterosis, you're still getting the benefit of that in terms of reproductive efficiently, cow longevity, productivity. So we think about optimum genetics. I think we want to look at what's optimum for a genetic level of production and within a herd, and then how do I marry that with hybrid vigor to allow me to benefit from that in my own cow herd. This quote by Dr. Rick Borden is a little bit haunting for me as we think about breed selection or cattle genetic selection. He says if you think about breeding for an optimum, it means to have a target in mind or a target in sight beyond which you don't want to go. Meaning I have a cow mature size, I have a cow level of milk production, I have a weaning weight that I think is optimum for my environment, and my success level is not on continuing to move, but pulling my genetic base tighter around that optimum. That's where success is. It's not just making change. That's a little different mindset, I think, than many of us have had in terms of genetic selection and decision making. I think we can't forget what the cow's competitive advantage is compared to the other major meat products in the meat case. That cow's competitive advantage is that she can take low quality forage and convert it into a high quality protein product that has the most value in the meat case. How do we take advantage of that cow's competitive advantage as we think about her two other competitors being pork and poultry? I think we can't forget that 75% of that cow's feed resource, or in terms of what we think about all the way to harvest, when I say cow, I make that genetically, but 75% of the energy base that goes into producing a pound of beef comes from forage. And anything we can do to limit our interfering with that cow's ability to utilize that forage effectively and convert it into protein is really where I think our advantage is. Which means we also might need to shift our thinking a bit and thinking more about profit per acre rather than profit per cow. And what I'm thinking about here is that our forage crop is really the crop we're growing, and then we're harvesting that effectively with a cow. And so if I think about that, I'm really looking for a harvester that can do that efficiently at low cost, convert that into a high quality product, and do that with the resource base I have. And that might be a cow that's not maximum in terms of production, but maybe a little something less than that that can more effectively use my resource. This is my list of what I think a successful cow does. I think she uses the available forage and feed resources she has to her. She uses what you've got. We got to try to find a cow that does that. Does that mean we don't provide some strategic supplementation or some things like that? No. But boy, I want a cow that uses what I've got, because that's the cow that's going to convert that into a quality product for me. I want a cow that can conceive and calve at 24 or 30 months of age. Now, some of you, when I said 30 months, that might have caused a little bit of heartburn. But as we think about cattle that are adapted to difficult environments, we might need to be willing to get up a little bit of early maturing to have a cow that's going to last longer. I might be willing to let a cow be a little longer to get to 30 months if she'll live in my herd 3 or 4 years longer, because of that lower growth level that's a little later maturing also brings some longevity. Now again, that's not traditional, but I think as we think about challenging environments, maybe I'm willing to accept that. I think we want a cow that doesn't require any treatment or calving assistance. She's got to bring a healthy calf to the weaning pen. Doesn't have to be the biggest calf, but needs to be one that's healthy, can go on and grow. I want her to rebreed and calve on schedule. Again, I want her to do that with minimal feed, harvested by me and supplementation. And then I want her to do this for a long time. That's really what a successful cow does. So as you think about your operations, as you think about your forage resources, as you think about what the future may hold in terms of environmental stress, what are the characteristics of cattle that not only survive, but thrive in your environment? And then as you think about what kind of cow is going to fit the future, what do you think she looks like? The other thing that's really challenging from a beef genetic standpoint is that it's so slow to make change. The bull you buy this spring, you're not going to have daughters that calve from that bull for 3 years. She's not going to be a mature cow till 2031. And so if you're wanting to take a cow herd that maybe is bigger than you want, has more milk production than you want, and pull that cow herd back, it's going to take some time. The other thing is you're probably going to have to use some genetics that are beyond where you want to end up if you want to pull a cow herd back to where you want to be. And boy, that's a major shift mentally to go buy a bull that's below breed average. Did you hear what I just said? I might need to go buy a bull that's below breed average in milk production and weaning weight and mature size. For many of us, to buy something that's below breed average is pretty hard to do. And I think that's mentally a challenge for us as we think about genetic selection and Optimum. So in my opinion, I think continued selection for greater growth, greater milk production at a cow-calf level, if an environment can't support that, it's not to your benefit. Now, has greater genetic growth and performance been a benefit to feed yards and all the way to the rail? And the answer is yes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so, if I can have a maternal line and then have a terminal line, great. But I understand the challenges of that logistically in this kind of environment. If I've got 30, 50 cows, to try to have a maternal line and a terminal line doesn't work. Now, maybe I can buy those maternal lines from someone else and use a terminal bull, but there's challenges that go with that, right? Where do I source those? Are they adapted to my resources and environment? And so there's some challenges that go with that. This quote by Dr. Bob Taylor, I think if I was going to summarize what I've just shared with you, probably does it well. He's long since passed away, but a great thinker as it thinks about genetics and cattle selection. He said, profitable cattle are usually productive, but productive cattle are not always profitable. I can have a cow herd that's tremendously productive but not profitable. I can be providing tremendous amount of resources to her, have great weaning weights, great breed ups, and be losing a lot of money because of the cost involved in doing that. And so I think we want to keep that in mind as we make decisions. So as you think about your own operation or the clients that you work with, I think we can't forget that reproduction at the cow-calf level is our fundamental thing. We've got to have a cow that brings a calf, right? We also have to recognize that in general, and Dr. Lolleman's going to share some data that's going to challenge us, and I appreciate that, but in general, bigger cows eat more. In general, cows that produce more milk are going to require more inputs in terms of energy, protein, quality of forage. In general, that's the way that works. And I think we also have to think about what's optimum in terms of weaning weight. It's probably not maximum for your operation. Optimum is probably something less than what the maximum weaning weight that you can get. I think we also have to continue to look at some of these non-production traits such as hair shedding, heat tolerance, disease resistance, pest tolerance, disposition. When I mean here disposition, I want a cow that's got enough disposition that she gets that calf up, gets it to nurse, and keeps the coyotes away or black buzzards or whatever your predator is. I don't want a big dummy out there that can't figure out where she left her calf. That cow doesn't bring me a calf to the weaning pen, guess what? She didn't do me any good. And frequently, some of those big dummies are super pets, but they don't have enough sense to take care of their calf. And so we got to have some balance there, right? I want a cow that gets that calf up, that's got enough attitude that coyote comes over the hill, she takes after it, but also one that's not so crazy I can't handle her. And so I think we got to think about that and recognize that. We want a cow that's got some resilience, that can handle some heat stress, that can be able, or in your environment, heat stress, in my environment, it's cold or whatever it is, whatever your environment is, we want some resilience in those cows. As you think about your genetic supplier, and again, I'm going to step on some toes here, are they raising their cattle in an environment that's similar to yours with similar kind of management practices? If they're not, I don't think it should be a surprise when you bring those genetics to your operation that they don't perform in the same way that they did for them. I think the challenge here also for me is, if you're using AI and you're pulling semen out of a semen tank, what's the environment that genetic bull came from when you pulled that AI straw out of the semen tank? What's their resources? Where were those cattle grown? What's the management practices that are there? If I'm using a bull from Montana that came out of, and I'm using him out of a semen tank in Kentucky, I maybe shouldn't be surprised that his performance in terms of his calves are not what it did somewhere else in a different set of resources. I guess to wrap up, again, this is contrary to what many of you have been taught and learned, but there's many circumstances where I think below breed average bulls may actually be better. Not all, okay, but when you think about optimum for your environment, your resources, it may be that a below breed average bull is a better fit for what you have, your production environment, and what you want to do. Again, that's not traditional, but I think it's something that you have to consider if you've got cattle that are not working in your environment. And then I think we have to recognize that we want to be selecting for cattle that have some resilience, that have some ability to handle stressors as we go forward. Increasingly, I think that's going to be part of the environment we operate in, and the cost to mitigate some of those stressors is going to become more and more expensive. So we got to have cattle that fit. All right, with that, if there's time, I'll take a question or two.
I hope you can all recognize you've just heard a presentation by someone who's had cattle that were on your books. Is that on now?
Good presentation. The question I got is, it's a good presentation. The question I have is, in Kentucky here, we have, just like this past year, we had like 6 weeks where we had no weather or no rain. The forage went south, and then we got other years, just like out in California, where they got extra years of rain, and the forage just grows exponentially, and that's why they have all the wildfires out there. So how do you plan around a year that you're going to have good forage versus a year that you don't have good forage? And I think, just personally looking at the presentation you had, you would want to select for the high genetics just to protect those years where you've got good forage versus those that don't.
Yeah, I think the challenge becomes is that if I've got a lot of years, maybe I've got really good forage, what's it cost to mitigate the time when I've got poor forage? And so maybe it's 1 out of 10 that I've got a real negative time. Maybe I'm willing to supplement during that time to bridge that gap. But I think you have to think about what's the long-term situation I'm dealing with and find cattle that fit the long-term. And what's my long-term forage supply quality? If I need to just mitigate a few negative times, I can do that economically, that's probably fine. But if I'm having to do that really often to have those cattle perform, then economically, I think that becomes more challenging to make that work. Does that kind of get to what you were asking there? Okay.
Anybody got another question? There will be an opportunity to end.
I have one. I actually experienced buying the best bull semen weaning weight and annual weight gain, and I didn't think that I was getting what I should expect from the traits shown. And I don't know how, but I came to the point that I'm probably not feeding them the same way those genetics were being fed. the animals. And so I started buying different traits because of that. But I sell to folks who are going to put these animals on a feedlot.
Yep.
And so how do I balance that? Because I want those calves to grow fast. I guess what I'm asking is, when they get to the feedlot, will some of that high rate weaning kick in?
Yeah.
I want those buyers to come back to me to buy more.
Yeah.
And so I want to give them a product that's going to grow fast.
Yep. And let's just be candid. This is the major tension, right? The major tension is that the feed yard wants an animal that can grow extremely rapidly on a concentrate diet for 150 to 200 days. Is that a very different resource than you have at the cow-calf level? It's tremendously different, right? Do they want cattle now that they can take to 1,600 pounds, 1,700 pounds harvest weight? Yeah, they do, because right now, there's not much docks till you get to 1,050 on a carcass weight level. So how do you balance the tension there? And I think it's real. I think the challenge becomes, in my mind, is that if I can't be profitable at the cow-calf level, providing what that customer wants, am I willing to go out of business so I can provide what they want? Does that make sense? So there has to be some tension there where I may not give them everything they want, but I still have to have something that works for me. And so that's the challenge, right? And is there tension? Yes. Is there solutions? It's challenging. I think that goes back to if I had a maternal line and terminal line, but ultimately I've got to have a cow that works on my forage-based resource to stay in business. And that's the challenge that's there. I also understand from a C-stock perspective, if your customers are geared to buy trait leaders and that's what they're paying you for, guess what you want to tend to provide for them, right? And so it's pretty hard to pull back from that. So we're in a tension time, I think, where we have cattle that are not adapted in many environments, and to pull back from that is going to be a major mental shift.
I got a quick question over here. The presentation was great, and you've thrown a wrench into the gears of most of us sitting out here. But my question is the Bos Indicus aspect of it. Of that 25% introduction, do you see their offspring getting docked? Because we'll get docked if we have here like crazy, like you mentioned, like in Nebraska as well. But along with that, a lot of us around here are starting to retain and finish to locally market. Do you see a difference in the meat quality, the accomplishment of the meat quality with that influence as well?
Yeah, so I think if you look at Brahman breed, they've obviously made some changes in selection for greater tenderness in those genetics. I think the challenge becomes, again, there's this tension. What do I give up by not using that? And if what I give up is greater than the value I would take or the discount I would take, I still may be willing to take a discount because I capture greater value on the other end. Now, that's hard to think about, right? Because it's hard to go to the sale barn and realize I took a 10-cent discount than my neighbor did because I had some ears showing, right? But what if my cow was much more productive and profitable even though I took that discount? So I sold a product for less, but I made more money. Does that make sense? That's a tension I think we wrestle with in this kind of scenario. And I'm all in favor of how do I meet my customers' needs. But if I'm meeting my customers' needs and I'm losing money, that doesn't work. And that's the tension I think you're in. Is that accurate? Yeah, okay.